You are now listening to a podcast made in collaboration with the Copenhagen College Radio.
Hey everybody, welcome to episode 23 of the Social Media and Politics Podcast, bringing you expert insights into how social media is changing the political game. I'm your host, Michael Pacetta, political scientist at the University of Copenhagen. Make sure you keep up with all our latest episodes by subscribing on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts. And connect with us on Twitter at SMNP Podcast and swing by our Facebook page, facebook.com/Social Media and Politics Podcast. All right, y'all. Thanks so much for tuning in. Got a great show lined up for you this week. We're going to be speaking with Eric Wilson, who was the digital director for the Marco Rubio campaign in the latest U.S. elections. For our non-U.S. listeners who weren't watching the race so closely, Marco Rubio is a senator from Florida. He was one of the 17 Republican candidates looking for the nomination in 2016. And he's a younger politician. He's 45, and he presents quite a youthful image. You'll often see him throwing a football. He's of Cuban-American descent, so there was a kind of expectation that he would connect with Hispanic voters, maybe lure those in for the general election. And he had his moment. He was up there for a while as the kind of establishment rival to Trump, but didn't end up getting the nomination. And what I wanted to ask Eric, and what this episode is all about, is how the Marco Rubio campaign was using Snapchat, because this was the first election cycle where Snapchat was a social media tool that campaigns could use. And personally, I was planning to write a paper on Snapchat. So I emailed all of the different campaign directors to interview them, and only two got back to me, which was Eric from the Marco Rubio campaign and a guy named Matthew Oskowski, who headed digital for Scott Walker and Donald Trump's campaign. And I'll be releasing that next week. And a little bit of drama from my end. Turns out I'm not going to do the paper just on Snapchat. I don't have enough data. I missed some key politicians like Trump who were on Snapchat, but I didn't know about it. So I had to broaden that paper to Instagram and Facebook. But the reason I'm saying all this is I still found it very interesting to talk to Eric just about Snapchat use, but you get a little bit of more insight into the campaign overall and where does Snapchat fit into that larger strategy, which is, I think, having talked to these two directors, it's really during the primaries, it's about taking every opportunity you can get, especially if there's 16 other candidates you're going against. So Snapchat's a medium to use, Instagram's a medium to use. I mean, you're just taking any and every opportunity to connect with voters, and, you know, even younger voters. They might not be able to vote this election cycle, but if you plan to run again in the future, you want to start building that positive relationship early and getting that recognition out there, especially if you can do it for free. So I found these interviews super interesting, super insightful, and I hope you enjoy listening to them. So without further ado, let me go ahead and introduce Eric. My guest today is Eric Wilson, digital director for Ed Gillespie for governor, and previously was digital director for the Marco Rubio for president campaign. You can follow him on Twitter at Eric Wilson and subscribe to his newsletter by visiting learntestoptimize.com. Eric joins us via Skype from Arlington, Virginia. Eric, thanks so much for taking the time out, and welcome to the Social Media and Politics Podcast.
Hey, no problem. My pleasure. Happy to be on. I'm a big fan.
Thanks. That's great to hear. So you were digital director of Marco Rubio for president, and I'd like to ask about your prior experience before joining the campaign. What background or sector were you coming from?
Yeah, so I've been working in politics and digital strategy since as long as that field's existed. In 2014, I was digital director for Ed Gillespie for Senate, a Senate race here in Virginia, where we came within 0.8% of the vote to be the upset of the night. Unfortunately, couldn't seal the deal. No one expected us to win, but we believed and did some fun stuff there. And then after talking to several of the presidential campaigns, but obviously I thought, Marco really represents the future of our party and really enjoy his personal story. And so that's why I signed up for his campaign. And prior to that, I've had roles on Capitol Hill and working with think tanks and nonprofit groups and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm. Specifically with digital?
Yeah, so I was digital director at the American Action Forum in 2013. And then prior to that, I worked at a digital agency called Engage, which is a pretty well-known firm within the business on our side of the aisle. And before that, worked on Capitol Hill with Congressman Michael Burgess, helping out with his social media in the very early days when Facebook and Twitter were just coming online.
And what's the kind of, I don't know if culture is the right word, but I mean, is there kind of a core group of digital directors? Like, do you know who's working on the other campaigns, or is it a pretty large group?
Yeah, it is a pretty tight-knit group on the Republican side. It's interesting to see the generations. There are the folks who sort of grew out of the Bush-Cheney 2004 election, like my old bosses, Patrick Ruffini and Mindy Finn. And then, there's sort of a new wave of us who worked on presidential campaigns this cycle. And so there are not a lot of us, but we are trying to build more talent and bring more folks into the ecosystem, which is one of the things I'm hoping to do with my newsletter, Learn, Test, Optimize. Just making sure that we focus on that community and keep people there, because there certainly is the tendency for someone to do really well in politics, make a mark, and then go out into the corporate or business world. And we unfortunately lose that experience and expertise.
Right. And speaking of that newsletter, I just signed up this week, so I haven't got the first.
Welcome. Thank you.
The first batch yet. But again, the website is learntestoptimize.com. What does that newsletter provide?
So each week I curate sort of the top reads in advertising, advocacy, content, community, data, email, technology. Security is increasingly becoming of interest to campaigns. And so take interesting articles that I find from hundreds of sources around the internet. I spend a lot of time just reading and then selecting the stuff that's going to be most relevant to people in this industry, specifically decision makers and strategists. Really trying to focus on actionable items for our readers.
Right. And we'll put a link to that in the show notes. And you have all of the previous newsletters archived, so you can go through them and get a whole wealth of interesting stuff there. So specifically for this episode, I'm interested in how the Rubio campaign used Snapchat during the primaries. When did you first establish the Rubio Snapchat account, and what was the motivation behind it?
So we launched the Snapchat account on the day Marco announced in April of 2015 in Miami. We had a big announcement event at the Freedom Tower there in downtown Miami. And that was the first day we did it. We knew that we wanted to be on Snapchat because the user base had grown to critical mass at that point, and we knew that the platform was going to continue to grow in importance over the next couple of years, and we hoped as we got closer to the election in 2016. And so that was the day we launched it. I was behind the camera that day, and Marco was announcing, that we had a big announcement coming up, and then we shot scenes from that, including some behind the scenes. And that's really how it all started.
And I mean, there was a lot of hype going into the election. I mean, a year and a half before about what role Snapchat would play. Was that hype something that was felt among digital directors?
I think there was definitely hype behind it. There was also some very good outreach on the part of Snapchat here in the United States, particularly with Peter Hamby, who they had recruited from CNN to be leading their coverage of the presidential campaign, as well as Rob Soliterman, who had previously been with Google, and they'd done outreach to make sure that the Republican voice was there, and particularly building Snapchat Stories, that feature. They were very focused on making sure that content was balanced, that they had content from Republicans and they had content from Democrats. So you saw Hillary Clinton's announcement the day before Marco's event in Miami, and they had a big sort of nationwide, Hillary Clinton has launched her campaign Snapchat story and pulled in views from a lot of different people. They did the same thing with us and every subsequent candidate after that. So anytime you have an opportunity with that scale and that kind of attention, you definitely jump on it.
And do you know, was that something that was organized by Snapchat, I guess for free for the campaigns, or did the campaigns actually have to organize that?
So that was something that Snapchat had decided that they wanted to do, and they were going to make it available to all of their users. And, we're in a position where they wanted to make sure that was available to both sides, and went ahead and did that.
Yeah, I was just curious about that. So who was the target audience for the Rubio Snapchat channel?
The target audience is obviously the demographic of Snapchat users. It continues to skew older, I think, as the network grows and builds. But obviously, Marco is the future of the Republican Party, and with that, millennial Republicans are on Snapchat, and we wanted to make sure we were speaking with them. So it was definitely a little bit of a lighter tone and approach in terms of the content that we were putting out on Snapchat, as compared with the content we would put out on Facebook, which skews to a much older audience in the primary electorate.
Because I'm curious as to whether, and I'm going to ask you about the specificities of having a Snapchat channel or story in just a second, but with Snapchat, you have to have people either put in your username directly or maybe use a snap code just to see your content. So what I want to ask you is, was the content that the Rubio channel was putting out, was it meant to shore up support? Like, was it aimed at supporters, or was it a net cast at a broader audience?
Well, so, I mean, we looked at some stats that Snapchat provided to us, and it showed how much time people were spending on the platform, the positive reactions that their users had to brands and companies and celebrities being on the platform. And we wanted to make sure that Marco was there. If our voters and supporters were going to be spending time there, and we could have a conversation with them or a contact with them that way, we wanted to do it because, as you know, we're becoming increasingly fragmented in our media consumption. So if we have voters who are on that platform, we need to be there.
Mm-hmm. And how did you go about promoting the channel? Because I noticed when I was collecting snaps for the study I'm doing that, I didn't even know Jeb Bush was on Snapchat until literally the day before he dropped out the race. So how did you go about making it known that Rubio had a Snapchat channel?
Yeah, so it's actually, as you already mentioned, it's very tough to drive people to Snapchat. They're making it easier. Unfortunately, that feature wasn't available to us before the election was over. We focused on a few things: cross-promotion on our different social media platforms, Facebook and Twitter, obviously, where we have a very strong presence, making sure people knew that if they were on one of those platforms, they should also check us out on Snapchat for particularly unique content exclusive to that platform. And we also did some giveaways with our store. So we would say, hey, tweet us a screenshot of this snap so we know you're following us, and you'll be entered to win a free hat or something like that. And then obviously the stories around the debates and the elections and things like that would include snaps from Marco, and that would trigger people to say, oh, okay, I'm going to go in and find him.
And when you mention content exclusively for Snapchat, what does that entail?
Well, so, the unique thing about Snapchat is it has to be done right there. You can't upload a photo. You can't edit a video. It has to be physically from that device. So you were seeing stuff that was coming right from, where Marco was at that exact moment. It wasn't coming back to headquarters and getting filtered or edited in any way. And so that, included some things like behind the scenes of going out for an event, or a message from Marco while he's doing the walkthrough before the debate that night. And, it makes it difficult in some regards because you got to get it right then and right there. And the staff on the ground have other things to do, but it provided another very specific piece of content that people couldn't get elsewhere.
Right. I think anyone who's on Snapchat can identify with that. It's not just campaigns. I have difficulty myself catching that snap sometimes. You'll pull out your phone fast enough or whatever.
Right, exactly.
So in terms of, we were talking about how you were promoting the channel. In terms of metrics, at its highest, how many subscribers did the Rubio channel have?
You know what? I couldn't tell you off the top of my head because that metric is so opaque. Mm-hmm. It's not like a Facebook or a Twitter. We had a sense of people who were viewing the stories, but you weren't able to get a real sense of how many people were actually following. So that was one of the areas where it was a very challenging platform, just because it's hard to kind of go and make the case for resources when you don't have the analytics to back it up.
Right. It's surprising that Snapchat wouldn't be more, conscientious of that.
Yeah, well, I think that they're making steps to improve that, particularly with the new mechanisms for opting people in, and I think they're sensitive to that, but but obviously their priorities were in other places.
Yeah, so in our first episode, when we were talking with the European Parliament and how they use Snapchat, they were getting about 8,000 views per day, which I thought was quite small for the entire European continent. But I mean,
Yeah.
do you have a sort of ballpark estimate? Was it 5,000? Was it 10,000? Because there were about 90 million daily active users worldwide on Snapchat at the time.
Yeah, so on an average day, we would see a few thousand views, of our Snap story. Marco's out going from event to event. The big ones, around debate days and election days, where we are also getting our content into the Snapchat stories that we're running either nationally or in that state. We would definitely get up into the higher five figures of views and beyond, because the view count of that story counted towards our view count as well.
Oh, so when Snapchat had a general campaign story, if Marco Rubio was featured, you would get those view numbers?
Right. Exactly.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So I guess the idea being that as a total, if you weren't subscribed, but you would just get the content that Snapchat would show you,
right,
that was a large audience. But the actual individual Snapchat accounts of the politicians maybe didn't generate so many views.
Exactly. Yeah.
Interesting. So did you have, this is something I'm personally super curious about, did you have to confirm friends manually like you would for a private account?
So we never, we didn't confirm friends. We were purely in a broadcast mode, where anyone who was following us could see our story, but we weren't receiving snaps from folks.
That seems like a little bit of a different model or platform, kind of like a Facebook public page where there's different dynamics. Was there anything else that came with that the average user might not have access to?
No, and my understanding is this is a way you can configure any account. We just made the decision that, because the person who was on the road with Marco, who was doing these snaps, just simply did not have the bandwidth to review all the snaps coming towards him. We just kept it where the story was public. Anyone who wanted to follow Marco could follow, but users couldn't send snaps, so that his phone's not getting overloaded with messages. Right.
Yeah. Maybe that is a feature where you could open up your profile also for a normal user.
Yeah, it's in your privacy settings. It's yeah. I would imagine that a lot of big brands do it that way. Obviously, you don't want to. I wouldn't want to go through the snaps that people want to send to a candidate.
Yeah, I agree. So looking at these view counts, I mean, yeah, they're difficult to quantify, but did they seem to increase or decrease over the course of the campaign, or was there a big pop in the beginning that kind of just trailed off, or did it spike around big events like debates, or what was your kind of impression of what was driving the engagement and how the trends were over time?
Yeah, so it was a big deal right around when we launched. Obviously, that was our biggest growth day. And then you would see growth around particular events, debates, the Iowa caucuses, the New Hampshire primary, that sort of thing. And then, noticed a couple of pops, when there would be a feature on Snapchat use and stuff like that. But I think the growth was more steady. We acquire a few fans here and there. And then every now and then we do a big push, like a giveaway or a cross promotion where it would add more followers. But, I will say that our strategy was not one of growing that channel. That was not the success metric that we were looking at there. We mainly wanted to make sure that we were present on that platform for our supporters and users who were there. We wanted to reach them where they were.
And what about engagement from their end? Did you get any snaps back? And if so, what were the kind of trends there?
The big engagement we did see from our supporters was if they would be at an event with Marco and get their selfie with him, and they would want to do that on Snapchat, but also save it and then send it out on Twitter or Facebook, something like that. But again, our approach was less of the, our community management focus was primarily on Twitter and Facebook.
Right.
just because you have more a scale there, and there are better tools for engaging with your community.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that makes total sense. But I'm still curious as to, what the thought process was behind it, particularly in terms of the content you were putting out. So what was kind of the main idea about what exactly would be snapped? Or was it just, as you said, kind of when the moment was there, when everything kind of connected?
Yeah, so we had the Snapchat account that was following Marco around was managed by Robert, his what we call body man in the business. He's with Marco from basically the moment he wakes up to the moment he goes to sleep, and make sure that he stays on time and that sort of thing. So he is the one person on our staff who is with Marco at all times. And we encouraged him to take snaps of every event that we were at. And what Robert told to me one day, he said, I'm just going to keep snapping and pushing the envelope and getting as interesting and edgy as possible until you take it away from me. And I said, that is the perfect way to approach it, because I knew he wasn't going to go over the line. But as you know, to sort of break through on a place like Snapchat, you've got to be interesting. And so I think, as you can tell with our content, I think there's a sort of one of the things I'm really proud of with the campaign overall is that there was a certain benefit to being part of Team Marco, getting the lingo, getting some of our inside jokes and that kind of stuff. So we wanted to make sure we rewarded the people who were loyally following, not just the people who are casually following.
Right. And one of the things that stuck out when I was looking at the Snapchat video, something that kind of stood apart, I think, from the other candidates, was that Marco's channel was very first person, very personal, in the sense that there was a lot of references to my or our, instead of a more objective language. So Marco Rubio would be at the Iowa State Fair on bumper cars, and he'd say, hanging with my family, for example, versus like a objective documenting of what was going on. Was that a sort of calculated decision, or was that just kind of what Robert how he wanted to do it?
That was, he had total creative control. That's I think what you were seeing there is the sort of the thought bubble of what Marco was doing at that exact moment from one of the, people on our teams who would have known him best.
Yeah. And there was another trend that I think stuck out for me with Rubio, which was a lot of the snaps were showing the kind of behind the scenes of different mainstream media appearances, which
right.
I thought was interesting because I never really saw how the whole green screen thing, went. Yeah. But
we ruined it for you.
Yeah. Was there a sort of reason for capturing those movements, or was that kind of when it was still and actually could be focused on?
Yeah, once you get your candidate in front of that camera, you've got chance to breathe, right? So you've rushed from, say, an airport or an event. Now you're in the studio for that remote hit, and you've got a moment to snap. But also is a great way. Marco was our campaign's best messenger. He's the person who delivered his message the best, and we wanted to make sure that was front and center. And so, trying to get that message not just to a cable audience, but to people on Facebook and Twitter and Snapchat. And so just, again, repurposing kind of existing content and making sure, Marco's message got to every possible place we could get it,
Right. Yeah. Because in academia, there's a lot of talk about this hybrid media system where the online and the offline connect. And I was wondering if that was a sort of calculated strategy. But speaking of calculated strategies, you use geofilters like many candidates, kind of documenting where the candidate was speaking at different rallies. But there's a pretty interesting vignette, or I guess a sort of campaign that you guys did, which was the Vote Early Day Snapchat filter, which was promoted from your end. Can you tell us a little bit about that? It provoked some pretty interesting reactions.
It did. So one of the things that one of the challenges that we face on our side of the aisle, the Republican side of the aisle, is we need to get our voters better at voting early and voting absentee. There's a pretty strong mentality with our voters that you vote on election day. Mm-hmm. But we knew with Marco that we needed to bank as many votes as we could before election day in the March 15th Florida Republican primary, which for our campaign was, quite frankly, a make or break event. If Marco wasn't able to win the primary in his home state, it was really hard to build a rationale for the campaign to continue.
Right. And this was a big story that was being pumped by the media as well. Like this was a make or break.
Right. And so, with the profile of a voter who is going to vote for Marco, we wanted to make sure they were voting early. And that meant voting on the weekend. So we came up with an idea. We were sort of strapped for cash at this point. It's when you're at that point within that 72-hour window, it's a lot like a basketball game where the buzzer is hitting and you just throw it from half court. But I said, well, can we build, this vote early day? Say this Saturday before elections, vote early day across the state. And we need you to pledge to vote early. You got to take friends to vote early. And not only was that our digital strategy where we were driving people to take that pledge, we were sending emails. But it was also our earned media strategy. That was the message. We sent out a press release about Vote Early Day, and all of Marco's events that weekend were focused on early voting, near early voting locations. And one component of that was this Snapchat geofilter campaign that you mentioned. And part of the reasoning behind it was one, we've got younger voters, so we want to make sure that they have a reason, an incentive to go vote, right? So there's a little bit of a value add of you got to go vote to be able to get this geo filter and really show your support for Marco.
Because it was only targeted at polling stations?
Exactly. So every location in Florida that was open for early voting on Saturday and Sunday had the geo filter, and that was it. It was not a statewide play.
So this is kind of like a badge someone would have.
Exactly. Yeah. Sort of like the old Foursquare badges. And then, knowing that Snapchat was the thing that everyone was covering in 2016, we knew that it would also get us some earned media if we had a Snapchat component to this strategy.
Yeah. And what I forgot to mention is it had a little box that you could draw a check mark in, like a little ballot box, which was using kind of the interactive part of Snapchat, which I thought was cool. And
so that was one of the really important things for me. Anytime I design a geofilter or a Snapchat lens, I want to make sure that there is a component for the user to interact with, right? Because the whole point of Snapchat is not just taking photos that disappear, but it's also giving that user the creative tools to change their pictures right there on their phone. So that's why there is a real connection with our geofilter, because you have to take your finger and mark the box next to Marco's name.
Right. And how did that work in terms of the earned press that you guys were going for?
Yeah, so we obviously got a lot of press within the state of, Marco Rubio and his team are making a big push for early voting. But it really did kick off into the stratosphere when Donald Trump heard that we were making a big play at early voting. And he tweeted out a couple of tweets about, he thought we were trying to rig early voting and that early voting was really dishonest.
Right. Which is, I have some of the tweets right here. And one is, we are asking law enforcement to check for dishonest early voting in Florida on behalf of little Marco Rubio. No way to run a country! ! Another is, word is, early voting in Florida is very dishonest. Little Marco, his state chairman, and their minions are working overtime trying to rig the vote. I mean, this is by no means vote rigging.
Right. No. The Marco and his minions were just working really hard to get every vote we possibly could. And there was certainly there was a benefit to having him draw that attention to early voting. The most rewarding part of Vote Early Day for me was when we started to see tweets. We were monitoring mentions of vote early day, that sort of thing. When we started to see a group of Bernie Sanders supporters in North Carolina start telling people like, oh, it's vote early day, you got to go vote for Bernie Sanders. And so when it crossed over to just being a campaign gimmick to something that people thought was a real holiday was pretty rewarding, because we knew that we had gotten into the water table.
Right. This is super interesting. And after Rubio dropped out of the race, you switched gears and you were working with the Liberal Party of Australia for the 2016 Australian elections, which I think were kind of overshadowed by the U.S. one. But you launched a Snapchat lens for them that was more interactive.
Yeah. So, obviously for people who are familiar with Australian elections, they have compulsory voting, where if you do not vote, there's a $25 fine. And so election day, polling day rather, in Australia is a big event, and it takes place on a Saturday. And so what we wanted to do is we wanted to make sure that leading up to that, so the Thursday and Friday before polling day, which is known as the blackout period, there's no advertising on radio, there's no advertising on TV. We wanted to make sure that our core message was there to Snapchat users, which again skew younger than your traditional voter. And so for the first time in a political campaign, we worked with Snapchat to have a lens. And what would happen is you would see a ballot box where you would put in your ballot, and it was a liberal ballot, obviously. And when you would smile, you would activate the lens that says vote for the plan, vote liberals, the plan that works, and then confetti falls. So it was kind of whimsical, fun, but it reinforced the fundamental message that the Liberal Party has a plan, the plan is working, and we got to stick to the plan by returning the coalition to government.
Mm-hmm. And I guess it's a similar logic where somehow engaging or interacting with the Snap is it meant to make the Snap more memorable? Is it to hammer home a message, or is it to promote an event? Or what's kind of the idea behind that interactive element of an advertisement on Snapchat?
Yeah, so the reason you want to have an interactive element is to make it user-generated content, right? So you've now got I can make ads all day long that tell people how they should vote and why they should vote for my candidate, but I can't get I can't get the same impact that one of their friends telling them to vote for the candidate does. So the idea is that it puts their imprimatur on the candidate and the campaign, and they're lending themselves as essentially a spokesperson for a campaign.
Mm-hmm. And the Liberal Party of Australia is a sort of center-right party that stacks up pretty closely to Rubio's platform in the U.S. Ideologically. And I'm curious about that because it's also something that we interviewed Chasen Campbell of Harris Media for episode 6 of this podcast. They're a conservative-leaning marketing firm that only works with conservative candidates. So is there that kind of, there needs to be an ideological coherence or connection between the directors and the campaigns themselves? Like, would you work for a left-wing candidate, for example?
Well, I wouldn't work for a left-wing campaign. I'm a true believer. I'm only going to work for candidates, campaigns, and causes that I think are right. Mm-hmm. I'm not in it for the money, as it were. But what we had in Australia was a very unique opportunity where the timing worked out right, where I needed to, Marco suspended his campaign in March. They were making their decision in April. The stars just aligned there. And obviously, the Liberal Party in Australia, despite its name, shares a lot of values with the Republicans here in the United States, and vice versa. So I was very fortunate to get to go over there. But what I will say, it's not a new phenomenon for political operatives in the U.S. to go to countries abroad and help out with their elections and campaigns. And I always wondered why that was. And I don't know if it's a benefit or curse, but because we have year-round campaigns here in the United States, you are able to make a living as a person who works on campaigns and elections. You don't have that in places like Australia and the UK, where there's a very narrowly defined election period. And so there's a sense that, we play in the NFL of campaigns and elections, and we're able to provide some insights and lessons learned, and that we're at the forefront of it. So that's kind of how it works, and it's also it's a good way to get an exchange. Obviously, Australia is an important ally of the United States, and I learned as much from them as I hope they did from me.
And I haven't been to Australia myself, but it seems like a pretty cool place.
Very cool place. Yeah.
All right, just a couple more questions for you, which deals with Rubio's involvement.
Well, sorry. Yep. One more thing. I will point out that that election ended up being the closest election in Australian history, and I don't know that we could pinpoint one thing that flipped it, but I have to think that being present on Snapchat was a net positive, and in a close race like that, you look at everything that tipped you over the line. Right.
Very cool. And so how about Marco Rubio's involvement in Snapchat as a platform and then the stories you guys were putting out? Did he exercise much oversight, or was it up to Robert basically to just go with it?
Yeah, it was all Robert the Body Man. Marco knew it was going on. He would deliver messages, as you've seen, saying, "Hey, this is Marco Rubio. Make sure you tune in for the last Republican debate before the Iowa caucuses," or something like that. But he just, wanted to make sure that, our supporters and voters knew how hard he was working for the nomination. In all of the states that were in contention. And so we obviously had that mandate that we also needed to produce really high quality content. Marco expects the best from his team. He's a really good quarterback in that regard. And so as I mentioned, Robert is right in that demographic of people who are active Snapchat users. So he knew what it would take. But as far as, sort of day-to-day control of the messaging or content, there wasn't any from me or anyone else on the campaign for that matter.
Mm-hmm. And was he generally open to the idea of Snapchat, or did he kind of see it as a nuisance to stop and, give a message during an already very hectic campaign?
No. Marco really gets how important it is for us to be using the platforms, technologies, and techniques that are where people are at, right? So, he wants to take our message to everywhere he can, and really believes in the cause and the values that he stands for, that, he's willing to do whatever it takes.
And lastly, I wanted to ask you about something that I came across looking at your different Snapchats, which is there's often a text caption that says something's fishy and then the name of the state or place that you were. What's the reference there?
So one of the hotels that they were staying at, pretty early on in the campaign, and you know what? I think it must have. I remember exactly what it was. On the day we launched, Marco went to one of the local television networks there in Miami to do satellite interviews and that kind of stuff. And sure enough, there was an aquarium in the lobby. And so Robert took a snap of that. And then from then on, anywhere in the campaign when we would encounter a fish or an aquarium, there would be a note about that. Something's fishy was usually how we would flag that. So that was one of those inside jokes for our supporters. They always wanted to see if we could find a fish that day. And I guess there's a little bit of Florida life on the high plains of Iowa.
Damn, my guess was the Miami Dolphins.
No. I guess it's just the Miami beach mentality. Yeah.
Right. Well, Eric, thanks for clearing that up and so much more as well. I really appreciate your time.
Yeah, thank you, Michael. Thank you for having me on.
I've just been speaking with Eric Wilson, Digital Director for Ed Gillespie for Governor, and previously Digital Director for Marco Rubio for President. Remember that you can follow him on Twitter at Eric Wilson, and be sure to sign up for his newsletter, learntestoptimize.com. And that's a wrap for this episode of the Social Media and Politics Podcast. Thanks for listening, and I hope you enjoyed the show. Be sure to tune in again next week when I'll be speaking with Matthew Oskowski, Head of Product at Cambridge Analytica and Digital Director for the Scott Walker and Donald Trump campaigns. Make sure you're subscribed on whatever platform you're listening from if you want to get that directly into your feed. And lastly, remember Twitter at SMMP Podcast, our Facebook page, Social Media and Politics Podcast. I'm your host, Michael Pacetta, signing off from Copenhagen. See you next time.